the second event. This evening it's a privilege to be able to welcome Ilana Redstone, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and whose research focuses on the way certainty drives our tendency to judge harshly, demonize, and dismiss people who disagree with us. She's the author of The Certainty Trap, just published, which is what she's here to discuss this evening, and the co-author of Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in American Higher Education by Oxford University Press in 2020. She's also the creator of the Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes video series, which you can find on YouTube, and is co-director of the Mill Institute at University of Austin, which works with educators to create classroom spaces where settled thinking can be challenged and contentious topics can be explored together. She has a joint PhD and I keep wanting to say demography. That's not demagoguery, but that's not right. Demography and sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. More about Ilana's work can be found on her website, ilanaredstone.com. And this evening, she will be in conversation with Angela Bahns, Associate Professor of Psychology here at Wellesley, whose own research focuses on prejudice and discrimination. So please join me in welcoming Ilana and Angela.
Thank you so much, Liza.
Thank you.
Welcome, Ilana.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. The one thing I will say is that I actually am not affiliated with the University of Austin anymore.
Oh,
So nope, that's changed. Yep, that's okay.
thanks everyone for being here. I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time now. Could you start us off, please, by describing for us what you mean by the certainty trap and explain some of its consequences?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm just glad to be here. So thank you, Liza, for the invitation. And I'm excited that you have a Pluralism Initiative. I think that's awesome. So the certainty trap is the easiest way to understand what I mean in this context is to think about how we feel when we're in it. And so the certainty trap is when we feel contemptuous of people who disagree, when we feel that that's the person who disagrees is an idiot or some sort of hateful has some sort of hateful motive. And that's associated with several things, including, and I imagine we'll talk about, including treating our knowledge as definitive rather than provisional, treating our preferred policy outcome as though it has all upsides and all benefits and no costs. Right, so all of these things, seeing complex problems as simplified, right? So that all of these things contribute to certainty. And I'm able to obviously go into a lot more detail in the book. But ultimately the certainty trap, part of what I'm trying to do is distinguish the trap part from certainty. So the trap really is the contempt. I'm not trying to make an argument that we should be questioning everything, there's an interesting philosophical question there, but there are some things that are less interesting or probably less important to debate, certainly in terms of how they relate to democracy and our political conversation. And so the trap part is really the contempt that we have for people who disagree. And it has a wide range of implications that I imagine we'll talk about.
Great, thank you. So when we hold that contempt, is it particularly likely for certain types of issues?
Yeah. I mean, it tends to be for issues where we feel like the stakes are high. And where there's a very heavy moral component. So in one of the Bigots and Snowflakes videos, I use this example of, do you think that toilet paper should unroll from the top or the bottom? Like, who cares? Nobody. I mean, I guess you could get into an argument about it, but there's one obvious right way, by the way. But like nobody. But there's no moral component. The stakes feel really low, right? So it's very easy to say, okay, live and let live, and may 1,000 flowers bloom. And so when you look at issues, the more heated, the more contentious. So anything, these tend to be issues around race and gender, but it could also be gun control, abortion, immigration, and anything else. Pick your contentious issues. It tends to be things that people think of as kind of culture war type issues, and that's where that moral component tends to be really heavy, and the stakes feel really high.
So tell me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that part of the recommendation to avoid the certainty trap is to try and articulate the reasons behind our views, to explain where we're coming from, Is that partially right?
Yeah, no, that's fair. So the certainty trap, the way it works is that, and there's sort of two pieces to it, and one of them tends to be much more intuitive for people than the other. So one piece, and let me back up for a second. They both have this, to sort of avoid this problem, there's this overarching requirement that we sort of maybe intellectual commitment is a better way to put it, that we recognize that any idea, value, principle, or belief can be questioned. Anything, nothing gets a free pass. There's not my pet idea, not yours, not anybody else's. So that's like a pre-existing intellectual commitment. And then avoiding the certainty trap, this is where I'm saying there's sort of these two different ways to think about it. One has to do with what I said a minute ago about treating our knowledge as provisional rather than definitive. And so if you think about, the way to think about that is, if you think of a number line sort of from 0 to 1, where 0 and 1 occupy positions of certainty, we're saying cut off the endpoints. Now, we're just going to ignore for the moment that creates new endpoints, right? But for our purposes, right, that we're saying everything in there is a spectrum of confidence, and that's where we should be thinking about how confident we are in what we know and what we understand about both about the world and about other people. And then there's an understanding that there's a qualitative and categorical difference between, say, 1 and 0.99 and 0.99 and 0.98. That once you have sort of a microspace of doubt, that certainty is the thing that gives us permission to judge and condemn, sort of morally condemn other people. When you don't, even if it's a small space of doubt, then there's a question about, well, there's some chance that you're wrong, right, about what you know. And just to make this concrete, maybe it's about the relationship between gender and biology. Maybe it's about the causes of or solutions to inequality. I'm just trying to get right into something that would be heated, right? So like that's one piece, is just recognizing that we're living in that spectrum of confidence and not occupying positions of certainty. The other piece, and that tends to be a little bit easier for people to kind of get their head around. The other piece, and sometimes where what I'm saying gets a little bit lost, is that when it comes to your morals, your values, some other reason that you have for objecting to something, this is what you were sort of alluding to, the commitment is to being clear and precise about what it is, what that bedrock principle is that you're bumping up against. It's not about, there will always be issues where you cannot come up with in a position to the thing that you object to that, like for the opposing side, that makes sense to you. So like the example that I'll use a lot of times is, if I get a question like, well, does this mean that you're both siding something like slavery? No, it doesn't. And the reason that that's true, the reason that that's the case is because my intellectual commitment in avoiding this problem of certainty, because again, what I'm trying to solve for is that problem of contempt. I don't have to come up with a version of that argument that I think, like, I don't have to advocate for slavery, like just to put a finer point on it. But I do have, my commitment would be to say, all right, what is the principle that we're bumping up against that is inviolable for me, that it's bedrock for me. And it turns out that actually the worse something is, the more egregious it is, the worse of a sort of moral violation, the easier it is to name that principle. So in the case of something like slavery, it might be something like, I think all lives have equal moral value, or I think no human being should be allowed to enslave another, or whatever. Going back to what I said at the beginning, my commitment is that that's an idea, right? That's my principle, that's my value. I don't have to let it go, but if I'm really walking the walk, I do have to let someone else question it. So somebody could say, well, and just to use this example, well, do all lives really have equal moral value? Which I did have someone question me on once. I can make a decision about whether or not I want to have that conversation. But to me, it's sort of an interesting question, but if that's a choice that I can make, but that's my commitment, is to sort of naming that principle in language that the other person would agree with. I'll just give one more example if that's okay. Sure. So what it might look like is, let's say that I'm having a conversation with somebody, and I'm going to deliberately choose a less heated example, but I think it makes the point. Let's say I'm having a conversation with somebody who says, I don't think women should be allowed to drive. And maybe I'm not super excited about this. So I can say, well, you're obviously a raging misogynist. And now, but again, like, what's my goal? So maybe, I don't know, maybe it feels good, maybe whatever, but this is the sort of the righteous outrage, the moral indignation. So if I'm trying to avoid the problem of certainty, I've not succeeded, because if the conversation continues at all, like, we're in the space where this person's defending himself, or we're arguing about what it means to be a misogynist or whatever. I still don't want to agree. I'm not on board with the idea, as much as driving can be a pain in the butt sometimes. Like, I'm not on board with this position. So I might say something like, I think women should have equal rights under the law, or I think everyone should have equal rights under the law, or I think that people should be allowed to pursue their economic potential, and I think that driving is an integral is integral to doing that. Whatever. I'm just throwing these out as examples. Now I've disagreed. I can stand right where I was before. I haven't hung my argument on my assumption about the other person's intent, or about what they do, or I don't know if we'll talk about the fallacies in the book, but like what they do or do not know, that I just need to explain myself to them and then they'll change their mind. I've made it clear where, like, I haven't said, I disagree because that's an evil thing to say. Right? Evil would be, and it's a little bit of a silly example, but evil in this case would be, or in any case, would be just a very imprecise sort of sloppy way of expressing my objection. So whereas one, you're a raging misogynist, that would be sort of, you're in the certainty trap. And I think women should have equal rights under the law. And that person gets to, just to be clear, that person can question or challenge me, right? They might say, whoa, hey, you think women should have equal rights under the law? Like, do you think that they should be drafted? I don't even have to have an answer to that question. It's not that I have to have like everything sort of lined up and ready to go, but I do have to recognize, like, there's a question there. And I can say, whatever, I can say yes, no, I have no idea, I'm not sure, that's an interesting question, and I can still stand right where I was.
So I'm thinking that if somebody just tells me that they don't think women should have the right to drive, I might be feeling so angry that it would be really hard to actually articulate, I believe that all people should have equal rights under the law. Right.
Sure.
And so what happens when the emotions that we're feeling are so strong that it gets in the way of the recommended solution of explaining our position in a very rational way and articulating the value behind the position?
Yeah, it's a fair question. I mean, I would say that, as with most things, it gets easier with practice, but I would also say that one of the things about, so a lot of the work on, kind of reducing political polarization, thinking about civil discourse, a lot of and I frankly, it's super important work. It's focused on the interaction between two or more people, right? It's sort of like, okay, I'm going to put a red person and a blue person in a room together. We're going to interact, and you're going to see the other person's humanity, and sort of that. And I'm not like minimizing it in any way. I think this is all important work. It's what I'm doing is sort of solving the problem of certainty is solving a problem in how we think. And you can do that without interacting. I'm circling back to your question. Like, you can do that. And frankly, I think it's good to do that in a room by yourself, or in a room with entirely with people who disagree with you. And because it's really just how do I think about, what are the assumptions that I'm making? What am I taking as given? And so I'm saying that in the sense that as you get, like, because of the practice part, and then it's always, of course, we get heated, things get, like.
So if you don't have to devise it in the moment because you've thought about it in advance, what is the reason for the position, you might be able to articulate it better.
Well, I mean, the other thing is just, part of it is just recognizing that when we feel, and it doesn't just, I mean, mostly the implications are for political work, but I'll tell you just a short story, like, it has to, and sort of the political side has implications for, I think, which we'll talk about for democracy, but it has much broader implications too. Like, I was on the phone with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and she was having, she's totally anonymized. She was having trouble in her marriage. And so we were talking about this, and she was saying, and because of this, like, her husband was canceling a weekend coming up, like a guy's weekend trip that he had planned. And she had, the following weekend, she had a plan for a work trip that she was supposed to take. And he was saying, in her conversation with her husband, and she was telling me this when she was very upset, and she was saying, oh, he's going to cancel this guy's weekend thing, and he's saying that I should cancel this work trip thing the following weekend. And I'm hearing this and doing what I do for a living and writing this book, and I'm hearing this and going, I'm getting pissed off. And I'm like, well, because she never travels for work, and like this is a big deal work thing for her. And I'm like, his, guys' weekend is not the same as your like work thing that you've been waiting for. And I'm getting like, that feels really controlling and manipulative, and like I'm like really getting mad. And then we talk like 2 days later, and of course things have settled down for them. And we talked 2 days, and she's like, no, she's like, he really feels like if our marriage is in crisis, that neither one of us should be going away for the weekend. Like it wasn't coming from a place that was trying to be controlling. He's worried about the higher likelihood of infidelity. He's worried about, this. And I was like, like I'm just like, I totally get it. Like, I get it. Like I couldn't just say in my own mind, like that feels manipulative or controlling. Like it was like, suddenly I'm sitting there thinking about this case that's nothing to do with politics, this situation. And I'm like, yeah, I see how he could get there, regardless of whether or not I agree with him. I was like, I see how he could get there.
And you have to take the time to actually
Yeah.
listen to get there.
Yeah, and I'm like, oh, now I have to like understand his perspective.
Yeah. Okay, so we all know that we're in the midst of a heated and highly divisive presidential election season. So what do you think are the implications of the certainty trap for democracy?
I think that this, I've drank my own Kool-Aid, but like, I think this has implications regardless of the outcome of the election. So one way to think about the implications for democracy is there's a lot of talk about democratic stability, and what people mean by that as sort of thinking about these as problems that come as sort of there's one kind of linear political spectrum from left to right, and we have problems that come from the left or the right. And so if you are on the left, those problems you see them, and I'm not making an argument about equivalence or anything like that. I'm just making an observation. If you're on the left, you tend to see those as embodied in Donald Trump and the sort of those threats that go to what are considered the threats that go along with his candidacy. And potential presidency. If you're on the right, you tend to see it in kind of political correctness, wokeness, the censorious nature, the censorious part that can go along with that, etc. Right, and again, I'm not trying to make an argument that these two things are equivalent. That framing though, saying like, this is a threat from the left, this is a threat from the right, people argue about like, which is worse, whatever. I'm not sure those arguments ever really lead anywhere or anybody ever gets anywhere productive with those arguments. But that framing does at least two things. One is it sort of omits the fact that in a democracy, particularly in a two-party system, although I think it applies more broadly, there are feedback loops, right? And so that what one side is doing is often a response to or something or preemptive or whatever, like that it's related. What I do on this side is related to what the other person does on this side. And so that sort of fails to take that into account. The other thing that it does, and it being this left-right framing, is it tends to give us permission to ignore our own role in getting to the place that we've gotten to politically. And so there's another way to think about so you asked, what does the certainty trap mean for stability for democracy? You said, so there's another model of how to think about democratic stability. And it looks something like this. Imagine 3 blocks that sit on top of one another. And each one depends on the integrity of each one depends on the integrity of the one below it. So if the bottom one falls, the whole thing falls, right? You get the idea. So the block, and each one matters, right? With the contents of each block matters for democratic stability. The top block, you might think of as the machinery of democracy. So this would be free and fair elections, the separation of powers, limits on executive power, free press, like all of these things that we think of as kind of institutionalized democratic norms that sit at that top block, right? And again, remember, all of these matter. Right under that, you might think of it as this middle block is a widespread commitment to political pluralism. Right, so the idea that as part of a democracy, part of my commitment to being a member of the democracy is that I'm also making a corresponding commitment to political pluralism. Because without it, right, it's very easy for me to erode your, say, free speech rights if I don't have a corresponding commitment to political pluralism. It just becomes very easy to sort of chip away at everything else if that's not there as well. Organizations that are focused on things like, and we talked about this before, civil discourse, reducing political polarization, even pluralism to a certain extent, are largely, not entirely, but largely focused on that middle level of reinvigorating our commitment to political pluralism, right? Again, each level matters. Right below that is where the certainty trap comes in, because the block at the bottom, the way to think about it is the absence of contempt for people who disagree. Because you can have a room full of people following all of the norms of civil discourse. I am listening, I am reflecting back to you what you're saying, I can put words and what all of the norms of civil discourse, and everybody be stuck in the certainty trap, right? And stuck in the way that they're thinking. And so what I'm saying is the level that I'm focused on is actually that problem in how we think. And so if you think of this, if that model of democracy, then I think it becomes, if that sort of resonates, right, then I think it becomes clear where that fits in terms of what's at stake when we think about risks and threats to democracy.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I would like to talk a little bit about, so, you know, I'm a psychologist, and when I teach either intro or social psych, I like to say that there are two fundamental human motives, and we can, many psychological theories identify mental processes that can be traced back to these fundamental motives, and the motives are accuracy and self-esteem.
Interesting. Okay.
So I like to tell my students that people like to feel good and they like to be right. And that these are very overarching high level motives. And a lot of the subsidiary stuff really just feeds into feeling good about yourself or feeling like you're right.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we start with accuracy, I can actually see how certainty might operate in service of both accuracy and self-esteem motives. And my thought is that then this might present a challenge for our efforts to try and overcome certainty. If certainty is serving this need of fulfilling self-esteem and accuracy. Okay, so if we start with accuracy, you know, we live in a complex and unpredictable world where many of the most pressing and most polarizing challenges are inherently complicated, which you mentioned in the book. You know, we start with everything is complex that we're talking about. There's no simple solution. So in the face of glaring uncertainty, the subjective sense of certainty, or you might say the illusion of certainty, might actually be really comforting in helping people to manage their anxiety. That's what I'm thinking. If people need to feel like they understand the world and like they can predict how people are likely to behave, and admitting that we might be wrong and that the best solution to a complex problem is not obvious, might be pretty unsettling. So in that light, do you have thoughts about how we could manage the anxiety that comes with uncertainty?
It's such a good question. I mean, it is comforting. It's like a warm hug. It's super comforting, which is probably part of the reason why I had a really hard time finding a publisher for the book. Because I'm telling people to do something that nobody wants to do. Yeah, everyone wants the book that will like make them, you know, validate their outrage and why they're pissed off. And, you know, I didn't want to write that book. So, you know, I figured, fortunately I found a publisher before. My plan B was to put it on, you know, print it out myself and put it on windshields in the Walmart parking lot. But so it, you know, but that worked out. It is a hard question. I mean, at some level, so there's not an easy answer. I mean, all of the usual things to sort of reduce anxiety. But what I will say is that I'm making an assumption, and you're asking sort of a subset of a question. I'm making an assumption in this book, and that is, I'm making probably a couple of assumptions, but one big one, which is that that people care about largely one of two things: either reducing political polarization, kind of building social trust, increasing social stability, all of that stuff, or understanding as best we can what's true about the world. If you don't, I think it's a pretty good assumption most of the time. There are definitely cases where it fails. Like I can tell you at least 3 examples where I think it falls apart. But I think for most people, most of the time, in the places where we gather, I think it's not a bad assumption. But it does mean that you have to care about something more than you care about being right. And that's hard. What I tell students most of the time, you know, when I teach my own students, when I teach this, is I'll say like, because I try to be very clear. I'm just like, you don't have to listen to anything I'm saying. Like, you can ignore everything that I'm saying. But then what doesn't make sense is you can't then tell me that the thing that you're concerned about is political polarization. Like you can't, or, you know, viewpoint diversity or whatever the thing is that you want to call it. You can't really have it both ways. And so that's fine. Like, just pick, because, you know, don't tell me that you want this thing over here, and then, you know, keep making decisions that pull you in a different direction. So I don't know, that's not really an easy answer, but it's just sort of like, you can't have, at the end of the day, there's a tension, especially, but not exclusively on college campuses, but there's a tension between, right, sort of, again, like, there's not a great word for it, but, you know, all the stuff that gets wrapped into questions of free speech, viewpoint diversity, political polarization, you know, all of that stuff, and wanting people to feel safe, comfortable, etc. Like those things, those goals are in tension, and you can't have everything.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we can figure out how to talk to each other more effectively, if that might take some of the fraught tension away from some of these topics. It actually could bring the anxiety level down a little bit if you develop some skills to be able to navigate with confidence.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't think I'm not a magician, and like I talk about all of the most the more controversial, better. Like I talk about this stuff constantly. You want Black Lives Matter, you know, abortion, like euthanasia, whatever, all of the time. And I've, you know, every time I say this, I feel like lightning will strike me down. I've never had a problem. Like I find students to be extremely open. They know and I'm pretty like, we'll take ask lots of different questions, but if you come at it, if you really sort of set the tone that we can question anything, and also I will say, and I'll give you sort of three steps in a second, but also like in terms of norms, like what can you do and what can you practice? Get away from this idea that asking a question means that you disagree with something, and get away from the idea that rolling an idea around in your head means that you want to sign up for it immediately, right? So if I ask students and I say, okay, can you tell me, and I'll go back to the slavery example because it's so extreme. And I say, can you tell me why slavery is bad? They have to understand that is not an argument that it's not bad, right? That is just, can you put words, tell me why it's bad. I'm not arguing that it's not, I'm not disagreeing. I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to convince you that it's not. I'm asking you to do the thinking work to tell me why it is. And so like that's that's just that's the whole we can question anything thing. And then I would say, like, in terms of the practice is, for any position that you find objectionable, that you just makes you go, oh my God, like how could any, you know, human being, any morally decent human being come, or however you word it in your own inner monologue, try and think of a version of that argument that would make sense to you. And I'll tell you what I mean by make sense. And let me just say, I don't actually care if it's the version that's coming out of someone's mouth. It's because this is fundamentally about ideas. It doesn't have to be, because we're not always the best, we don't always express ourselves the best way. So if the person is against affirmative action or for affirmative action or whatever, and you're coming up with the version of the argument that would make sense to you, and I'll get back to that definition in a second, it doesn't have to be one that you've ever heard, or that's, like I said, that's come out of someone's mouth. So by makes sense to you, what that means is a version that you are not and this gets into the fallacies in the book, and so that you are not making an assumption about the person's intent. You are not saying, okay, well, they're just racist, they're just a snowflake, they're just whatever. And you're not making an assumption that they just don't have the right information. So you're not, and I think there's the name fallacies in the book, but you're not, so like, in other words, so that's the fallacy of equal knowledge, which is this idea that what keeps us apart on heated issues is that the other person doesn't have the right information. And if they just knew what I knew, that person would agree with me. And as human beings, we do this all the time. And it's not, I'm not claiming that information doesn't matter. I'm not claiming that education doesn't matter. I'm making a narrower observation, which is that even if we all had the same information, we would not all agree on abortion, Black Lives Matter, immigration, gun control, etc. That's the point that I'm making. And so when you are thinking, so come up with a version of the other argument that would make sense to you. Make sure you're not hanging it on any of these fallacies about your assumption about someone's intent or what they don't know, right? And then if you can't do that, if there's just no version, like again, to go back to the slavery example, like if there's just no version that would make sense to you because it's just so, whatever the position is so abhorrent, be clear about what that, you've hit something, you've hit bedrock. So be clear about what that is and express it in language that the other person would be on board with, right? So like I use evil as the example, like it's just too imprecise, it's too vague. The other person probably has a different definition, but I think all lives have equal moral value, very clear. You can argue with me about it, that's fine, but like, it's like the words have undisputed meaning.
Okay, yeah. Can we talk about self-esteem?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so people like to feel good about themselves, and part of what's wrapped up in that is our idea of what it means to be a good person is the expectation of consistency. So I was looking throughout the book for the part on cognitive dissonance, and it was there.
At the end.
Like, yes. So if I'm a good person, I generally act in line with my attitudes and values. And I act in a way if I act in a way that's not consistent with my values, I feel uncomfortable about that discrepancy.
Yeah.
And I'm motivated to change something to bring them back into line, right? That's the basic idea. And consistency motives feed into the higher order self-esteem motive. So it seems to me that there are culturally shared ideas about the positive value of certainty and the negative social value of uncertainty that contribute to this strong pull of the certainty trap. So for example, we expect our political leaders to be firm, decisive, loyal to their party's values, and leaders who change their position on an issue or admit their thinking has changed are often criticized as being weak or untrustworthy. And we have words for that. We might call them a waffler or a hypocrite or even a traitor, to use strong language. So I was thinking about to what extent there needs to be broader cultural change regarding the social value of certainty and uncertainty. If we're trying to embrace uncertainty as a virtue and prioritize clarity over partisanship.
Yeah, wow, there's a lot there. So uncertainty as a virtue. I think so. How would you do that? How would you encourage that kinds of, so let me back up for a second. About the politicians thing. So you made one point about sort of people changing their minds. I think there's another problem that this bumps up against you in the world of politics, which is that, and so earlier I said that there are I'm making an assumption that there are at least three ways it can kind of fall apart. One of them is with people running for office. Because you fundamentally have a different set of incentives, like you're trying to win votes. The incentive is to simplify, right? I'm good, vote for me, don't vote for that guy, he's bad. Another would be what you're trying to optimize for is, building a platform on social media, right? Outrage is going to get you that platform a lot faster than measured thinking. The other would be if you are trying to control a particular narrative with a fire hose of lies. By lies, what I mean is, I don't mean lies, something that you say something and I think you're lying. I mean, by lies, I mean something that you yourself don't believe to be true. Right, so in any of those cases, so those are places where this would break down. In terms of self-esteem and changing the norms around certainty, the way I see this argument and in the book and sort of the idea of certainty, I almost see it as I'm describing the way things are, like the world, and there are people far smarter than I am who have made this point, right? Including Albert Einstein, right? Who's talked about mathematics in the world of certainty, and there's a quote in the book about it, and which is that the world is fundamentally uncertain. right? This is, I mean, David Foster Wallace talks about this in that famous speech at Kenyon College. I don't know if you've read it. It's a wonderful graduation speech from 2005. It's amazing, where he talks about certainty. And so I'm sort of connecting the dots for people, hopefully in a way that's helpful, in a way that's clear about like, look, this is how it affects how we think. Certainty is the thing that paves the way for us to be morally outraged, righteously indignant. We can ignore that, we cannot ignore it, but it's there anyway. This is the way it is. And then how that kind of ladders up to democracy, right? And so I don't like, then the question of how do you get people to value that? It's hard. I guess to some extent, I hope that my hope, which may be a little naive, is that by pointing it out, there's some group of people who will care, who will say, okay, I get it. Like if I care about, say, democracy based on that model of stability that we talked about, this is something that I need to do. It's not going to be for everybody. There's always going to be people who are just rather be right. That's just the way it is. Yeah.
Yeah, that's unfortunate.
I don't need everyone to get on board. I need a critical mass.
But
Yeah.
if we were all more motivated to figure out the best solution to complex problems and recognize that the best way to do that is actually talking to people that bring different perspectives and figuring out how to work together across those differences, that there could be a lot of energy and excitement behind that being the goal and not, my side winning.
Yeah, I mean, as long as, again, where the certainty trap would come in would be like, well, what is best according to what, right? Like best, like, so, right, like, so first, I don't know how we have a conversation about what the best immigration policy is until we've made clear, like, I'm just using this as an example, like, until we've first been clear about, is the right immigration policy supposed to maximize the opportunities for people seeking refuge from situations that are worse off? Or is the right immigration policy the one that will maximize the economic benefit to people that are already in the host country? I don't know what best is until we are clear about that. But it's absolutely relevant, yeah.
But in order to clarify what that is, we have to at least talk to each
Yeah,
other.
we can talk to each other, yeah.
Okay, I'm mindful of the time. We want to save some time for questions in a few minutes, but I was really hoping that we could talk a little bit about the fallacy of known intent as it pertains to claims of racism. So in the book, you discuss some of the research on the psychology of prejudice and introduce the distinction between implicit bias and explicit bias, and highlight the important point that people might be influenced by negative stereotypes or negative feelings that they're exposed to in the broader culture, even when those negative beliefs and feelings don't match their consciously held beliefs. So it's actually incredibly common for people without any consciously held racial animus to act in ways that are racially biased. And this is what we mean by the phrase racism without racists.
Sociologist, I think, coined that phrase.
I believe it, because where I'm going next is the systemic level, right? And acknowledging that racism can operate at the institutional or systemic level and not just at the individual level. So in the book and in your video series, you talk a lot about intent matters and being cautious not to jump to conclusions in being certain that someone's behavior was racially motivated. And what I think you're saying, correct me if I'm wrong or please clarify, is that what we should reserve judgment and don't assume, when you say we should reserve judgment, what I think you're saying is that we should avoid the certainty that they are a bad person. And if our definition of racism includes the possibility that someone can do something that is racist and still be a good person, that they didn't have to have racist intent in order for the action to have harmful impact, then the goal of calling the behavior racist is not to demonize the person or say they're bad. The goal would be to acknowledge the inequity of the outcome and build awareness and to prompt behavior change. So what do you think about the suggestion that racist actions could be called out without necessarily assuming bad intent of the actors or labeling them as racist people?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. I think that what will happen, so if you're saying that, racism, so, and I think Eduardo, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, Bonilla Silva, when he wrote the book, Racism Without Racists.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so he was head of the ISA, president of the ISA at one point. So that racism can exist without racism intent. So, okay, so then calling out the behavior, so if you roll that tape forward, then calling out the behavior is, you said this thing, and I don't know, you ask somebody, I'm just, this is a silly example, but you ask somebody where they're from. Just right, so this comes up on, this is one of these questions that shows up in these lists of microaggressions and stuff. And I'm going to then tell you that, that is othering, that is a way of making people feel like they don't belong, etc. And now, so see, you can see where this is going. Like now I'm giving you, remember before I talked about the fallacy of equal knowledge? I'm giving you information. I'm explaining to you why what you said is wrong and why what you said in this case is racist, with the expectation that you will then change your behavior, right? I'm not judging you as a bad person, but my expectation is that you change your behavior. But what if you think that it's just really nice to ask people where they're from sometimes, and sometimes people really like it, and they like telling their stories about whatever. And then maybe it's a bad example, but I still think, so like, I'm not sure where you're going exactly, and maybe you can clarify with this idea that someone can be, if you're calling out someone's actions because you believe them to be racist, and maybe it's more helpful to just make it concrete, then what's the expectation? The expectation is that they change, I assume, or no?
Yeah,
Maybe
that their
an example?
behavior is influenced by a racist system, and that they're perpetuating the inequities that
Yeah.
system creates. And so if we don't identify it, call it unfair, and try and change it, the people operating in the system don't have to be bad people.
How do we
can give
know?
people the
Yeah.
benefit of the doubt and say, you might not have meant to treat these two students differently.
Sure.
But your assumptions have led you to give more attention to the majority group student.
Yeah.
I need to bring that to your attention so that you can stop doing that, or make a intentional effort to use awareness and controlled processing, to try and make sure your behavior is guided by your egalitarian beliefs.
Yeah. Okay, so sorry, it's always easier for me to think in terms of specific examples. So with what you just said, so let's say that like there's a classroom example, is kind of what you were saying. So let's say there's a classroom example and someone is paying, and the instructor is paying more attention to the white students and they're paying less attention to the non-white students, right? This is sort of what you're saying. And so like, is there a problem? Like, I don't know if what you're saying is there anything in the certainty trap that would say that you shouldn't then say to that person, hey, what you're doing here is like you are calling on the white students more, etc. I'm not sure there's anything in that I'm saying that says that's inconsistent with that, right? Like that's saying, because you can be clear about sort of why you're doing that, and it's about this again, right? This principle of sort of like, here I can say you didn't call on, there was a student sitting in the back of the room or had their hand up for 20 minutes and you didn't call on, whatever. Like I'm not sure that anything that I'm saying is incompatible with that. What I would say, so that's like a specific classroom example. If someone wants to come in and say, you know what, I'm not sure, I don't really think that wealth inequality is due to systemic racism, right? Like, let's say that's what someone wants to say. So that is a politically disputed claim, right? Like that is, it just, regardless of where you come in on that claim, it is a politically disputed claim between the right and the left about the role of systemic racism. I'm just using this as an example, right? Just to follow up on what you said, but the role of systemic racism in generating inequality. Do you want to, now we go back to the definitive knowledge versus provisional knowledge. Is that a definitive claim that inequality is generated by systemic racism, or is it a provisional claim? So how do you think about that? This is how it would go back to that. I don't know if I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but like, that's how I would come at that issue.
Okay. No, I was thinking that the book suggests that we should be really cautious in identifying behaviors as labeling them as racist, right?
Yeah.
And I think that the whole idea that intent matters is somewhat inconsistent with the body of work suggesting that racist action can happen without intent and awareness.
Yeah. So what I would say, is intent, so first of all, like one of the things I try and say in the book is that intent matters, it can't be everything, I think I said that in the videos as well. But it has to matter if what you're trying to do is create a space for diverse perspectives, reduce political polarization, it has to matter. Like you can't have, it's not a, we should do this, it can't work unless it matters. You can't have both. And that's not like, that's just an observation. So like, what does that look like in practice? So when I say, and sort of creating the space for people to think openly about really hard things. So if I walk into a classroom and I ask my students, and again, I'm in a sociology department, and I say, tell me about the idea of white privilege. Tell me why the idea of white privilege is helpful. Like, why is this a helpful idea? I don't care where do you stand on it, but just tell me, like, we're going to talk about lots of things. So tell me why the idea of white privilege is helpful. And they'll usually say things like, it helps us understand the importance of unearned advantage. They'll say it helps us understand and think about the way race plays a role in everyday life. Those are sort of the two of the most common responses that I get. And to which I usually say, yeah, that makes sense. Like, yep, that sounds about right. And then I'll say, okay, why would someone object to this concept? Like, why would someone explain to me why someone would object to this concept of white privilege? Like, what would they? And a lot of times, most frequently, one of the responses that I'll get is they don't understand the reality of racism. But now you're right in that fallacy of equal knowledge, right? They just don't understand. And I have to explain it to them. And then what happens if you explain it to them and they still don't agree with you? Right. And so there's that piece, right? This is how we think about contentious issues. When I press them on it, they will come up with other suggestions. So it might be something like, well, I get, it could be kind of divisive. I'm not really sure. This is after having laid out the advantages, right? Like, and the benefits of this concept. It can be hard to know, like, what differences are due to privilege, this kind of privilege versus that kind of privilege or whatever. Like, these are the kinds of things that they'll come up with. And it's the whole point. It's not like I have some checklist that I'm waiting for people to check off. It's just to get them thinking about it. Then you can say, okay, we've just come up with a bunch of different, like, yeah, sure, they're not aware of racism. That's one possibility. Now we've just come up with these other possibilities as well. And again, the example that we're talking about is white privilege. And there's a separate question on the table about how likely is, in any given interaction, how likely is this explanation versus this explanation when you're interacting with somebody? That's a different question. But if you understand that the probability of the explanation, the not racist explanation, is not zero, then you just have to ask yourself, well, what if you're wrong? Like, you could say, well, I think it's small enough that it doesn't really matter, but that's still another assumption. You're still making an assumption based on, now you've made a pretty widespread assumption about intent. And so again, like, you can do that, but you will not get the sort of open political dialogue, the viewpoint diversity, the social stability. You will not get the things, because of the model that we talked about, you will not get the things that you want. Because doing that, it has effects on social trust, on social stability, on democracy itself. It just does. And so we can make choices.
Okay. I would love to see if anyone in the audience has questions for you.
Hi, so this might be like beyond the scope of your work, so let me know if it is. So I was wondering if you've touched on judgments that don't necessarily lie in certainty, like something that's less, I guess, intense maybe than like politics or something so divisive. If it's like, okay, I see someone and I think, oh, their outfit's kind of ugly, or something kind of more shallow like that. And it's not something that's like, oh, I'm certain that's the ugly outfit, but something a little bit more, I guess, casual, if this is related to the things that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, it's an interesting point. The way I see it is, so like I have two thoughts as I'm hearing your question. One is, and I try to focus on this in the book, is that I'm really trying to solve the problem of contempt, right? So like the question would be, well, are you contemptuous of that person, or do you just think their outfit's ugly? Like, right? Like, so like that would be, that's one question that comes to mind. And the other is sort of part of, so like, let's set aside people's feelings just for the moment, like about like, if you walk up to someone and tell them their outfit, there's sort of social norms about, right? Like about what is acceptable to say to somebody and what's not. Like, there's a difference between saying that outfit's ugly, or even if you're saying it internally, like, and being clear with, it's not a political example, but right, like, but being clear with yourself about why do you think that outfit is ugly? And again, like in that example, the stakes are pretty low, but it's sort of like, if you have that, if you take that example and you paste it on something political, the analogy would be like, oh, well, I think it's ugly because I don't like, the mom jeans, or I don't like the boots or whatever, like that there's value in, and again, like the example is, as you said, it's not a political example, but that there's value in getting in the habit of being really clear about why we do and don't react to things the way that we do. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. My question is about whether you think all of us have equal moral responsibility to avoid the certainty trap, or whether some of us, like educators or people who have more time, more leisure, there's a greater moral incumbents on us to work to avoid it.
That's such a good question. Yeah, so sometimes I get myself wrapped in knots about like whether this is just a bunch of kind of intellectual navel gazing, which is not what you said. But I don't, and I don't, so I tend to do that personally just because that's just what I do. But I think that when it comes to, I think there are certain institutions where this matters a lot. I don't think it inherently has any political side to it. Like the problem of certainty, I don't think is specific to time or space, because again, it is the observation that this is what paves the way for us to be contemptuous of other people, and that's true across time and space. I think that because of it, and there's a whole chapter in the book on the certainty trap in institutions, and the reason I bring this up is because higher education is one of the ones that I talk about. I think you could expand it to education more generally. I think as educators, I think we have an enormous obligation. And I think that the other institution, and I don't mean to sound like I'm getting on some kind of bandwagon, but I think is the media. I think those are institutions where the problem of certainty is particularly pervasive, and I think it affects the way, and I think that so the problem of trust in institutions, there's all sorts of polling data that shows that how it's gone down, and including in higher education, it affects trust in all kinds of institutions, not just higher education, not just the media. And I think that a lot of that relates to the certainty trap, because remember, like, part of the problem with certainty, there's a lot of overlap between what I'm talking about and ideas around, for instance, intellectual humility, curiosity, things like that. The difference is that when you ask people, when you say we should really be more intellectually humble, etc., we're relying on our own ability to recognize when we lack that. And most of us kind of suck at it. Like, we're just not good at it. And by the time we realize, oh, we should be more intellectually humble about this thing, you're sort of halfway there. You sort of solved your own problem. And so by focusing on the problem of certainty, we're saying, no, it's that sense that the answers are easy, that the other side is an idiot or hateful or whatever. That's the thing you need to focus on, to be either questioning or challenging your thinking. But to circle back to your question, I do think, I don't know if I thought of it as a moral responsibility, though I can see how you got there. I think educators, I think we have an obligation to avoid this problem. And I mean, if I can add, I would say I don't think we're doing particularly well. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm a little curious about, I was hoping you could say a little bit more about contempt.
Yeah.
Because I'm a little unclear on whether you see contempt as the motivator for the certainty trap, or the certainty trap leads to contempt, or there's some sort of, back and forth between, like what is, first of all, what is the source of contempt, and then the interrelationship between that and the certainty trap?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm totally open to hashing this out because I love hashing stuff out. But I would say that the way I think about it is contempt is really the manifestation of certainty. It's sort of like, that's the thing. So like one of the challenges that I've had with that we were talking about before we started this group is figuring out ways to measure this empirically. Because you're asking people about something that they don't realize that they're doing. And so contempt, so it's almost, so one of the things that I've thought of, and I haven't yet had a chance to test this, but like basically asking people, to complete a sentence, like something like, people who don't support Black Lives Matter are blah, fill in the blank, right? Just leave the whole thing in, or people who do support Black Lives Matter are whatever, right? And you could code those, like you could, based on how people respond to that. Right, like, so the idea, so again, like, so the contempt is just sort of this broad umbrella term for the person who disagrees with me is an idiot or hateful. In their character, not just right, in like who they are as a person by nature. Does that make sense?
So this question is a little bit for both of you because you're coming at it from a sociological perspective, you're coming at it from a psychological perspective. And so I'm wondering what you're saying about contempt, is it sort of being the manifestation? I could also see it as potentially a kind of self-defense mechanism for when you're kind of feeling challenged about something. I'm just wondering if you could talk about the way that you draw on psychological methods for your sort of approach to this sociological problem, and then how you, Angela, in turn feel, in what way do you draw on sociology and what's happening around you as a kind of examination of underlying psychological tendencies?
Go ahead, go first.
Okay, well, since I'm a social psychologist, I think I already sit in that intersection because I'm really interested in measuring things at the individual level, but how they're affected by the immediate social context. So, for example, norms about what we expect in terms of we're expected to be decisive and certain in our opinion or not might shape our openness to considering that we're wrong. And in certain spaces, those norms might be more pronounced, or that they might be more permissive of disagreement and openness. And so I think that would be one way I would think about it, as your success in clarifying your thinking and articulating your values might depend on the environment that you're in. And so something like campus climate, supporting pluralism could be a really positive environmental factor in terms of individuals' experiences of contempt and managing their anxiety, and an invitation to clarify their thinking.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I mean, I think the way that your question reminds me a little bit of what you were saying before about self-esteem and sort of the emotional side of it. It makes me think of literature on affective polarization. And I guess I don't come at this. So I'm sure you're right that like contempt can serve, it can be an emotional reaction. The way I come at this work is not through the emotional side. I come at it through the almost epistemological and cognitive side. And so I would defer to Angela, right? So like, I think that I'm not saying that when I say that certainty leads to contempt, it leads to moral outrage, I'm not saying it's the only thing, right? I mean, it may be the sort of necessary but not sufficient condition, like, or maybe it is necessary and sufficient, right? Like, but that's the part of it that I'm focused on. So I think there is an emotional piece that makes things harder, just like for me when I was responding to my friend who was saying she wasn't going to go to this work thing the following weekend, like the emotional piece makes it harder. Yeah, and which has all kinds of implications. I mean, it's just that the difference is that when I disagree with someone, my feelings of frustration in that case and about my friend's marriage don't have implications for democracy. Really, it doesn't matter. But when you, at scale, on issues, on the heated issues, right, around race, gender, et cetera, has massive implications. Yeah. But it's the same mechanism. It's the same underlying mechanism.
Hi, thank you. I just had a question. During the whole talk, I kind of thought of my mother. And I always kind of, well, I wondered, like, of all the disagreeing to agree or the agreeing to agree kind
Yeah.
of conversations we've had. And I kind of want to see, I don't know if you touched on this, but I know that it was mentioned. Do you believe that this whole trap thing might have to do or is impacted by family dynamics or just kind of cultures in general? Thank you.
That's a good question. It has to be. I mean, in the sense that, I guess is your question coming from, like, you think that the reinforcement of family makes a certainty trap kind of thing more likely? Is that sort of where? Yeah, I mean, I guess, and I mean, it would be, I mean, if you think of a family, and I know not all families are like this, but like, if you think of a family as sort of an echo chamber, right? Although, again, what I would say, and I know it would take a certain kind of family to do this, but because this is about the idea, let's say like you're having Thanksgiving dinner or you're having whatever dinner with your family and you're all the same persuasion politically, right? You all just sit on the same table. It could be, if, I mean, right, like, because this is not fundamentally about those interactions, you could sit and have a conversation about, like, okay, can we think about, like, let's make the argument for building a wall. But like, it doesn't matter if anyone at the table agrees or wants to get on board with it, but just like, this is just about how we think. But I think, but to your question, like, I mean, a family can, to the extent that a family serves as a type of echo chamber, that reinforces reinforces our beliefs, then yeah, I have to imagine it can make things harder, but not impossible, right? Like, not impossible. Anyone else have a question? Okay, please join me in thanking our guests. Thank you so much.